Skip and jump through some scriptures tonight. The more I've been studying this about the book of David, it should have been his own book, David's story, it just amazes me the ups and downs he went through. And if you think about some of the Psalms he wrote, because some of them were just really happy and praising, and others are like mega depressed, give him some antidepressant. And when you think about the ways that he went through all of these different activities, then it makes sense. But it also shows me that anything he got in the midst of, he made it through. So if you turn to chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, I'll talk about a special woman in his life, a woman named Abigail. Abigail had this husband named Nabal, and he was against David, of course. And he just couldn't understand, why everybody was loving David. So if you turn to chapter 5, verse 10. Some people from David's camp had gone to talk to him. And he answered David's servants, "Who is this David breaking away from their masters these days? Why should I take my bread and water and meat I've slaughtered for my shearing and give it to these men coming from who knows where?" David always had a band of men with him, sometimes in the hundreds, sometimes smaller. And I don't think they had a supply cook. I don't think they had a chuck wagon, because whenever they needed something, they just go to the local people and try to get the food. They even went into the temple one time and ate the bread on the table, the corn on the table, which was supposed to be really bad. So he's bad-mouthing David, and of course David's men go back and they tell him what's happened. And David says in verse 13, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords, and David put on his. And about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Good tactician. Again, I was thinking this week about what a cool game this would make. But somebody tells Nabal's wife what's going on. Sounds like she was maybe the brains of the situation and the heart. Look at verse 14. One of the servants told Nabal's wife, Abigail, David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They didn't mistreat us the whole time we were out in the field. Nearly nothing was missing. Night and day, they were all around all the time. They were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. The men go and say, "We can't do anything with the master." Go to his wife, "Maybe you can talk him down a little bit." By this time, David had enough of a reputation. He should have known you don't diss David. You don't talk bad to David. So Abigail didn't talk to Nabal. She probably had lived with him a long time, and sometimes, talking just doesn't help. You ever known somebody like that, whether you were living with them or not? You just kind of figure that talking to them is over and done with. Someone read verses 18 and 19. Okay, Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep. That doesn't mean they had clothes on. I mean they'd been slaughtered and ready to eat, okay? 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband. Given what we know about people in this time and their households, can you imagine how she could just pull up all this stuff like this? She must have had a lot of servants to help her get all this ready. And I see this huge, on animals, but U-Haul of food coming down the road to David. As she was riding her donkey into the mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her. Now, where are they going? They're going to go to Nabal, because he talked bad. David had just said, "It's been useless all my watching over this fellow's property up in the desert, so that nothing was missing. He's paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David ever so severely if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." You think he was a little ticked off? Just a little? So when Abigail saw David, she gets off her donkey and bows down before him. With her face to the ground, she fell at his feet and said, Oh, let the blame be on me alone. Let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Beg, 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 beg. Beg, 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 beg. Verses, beg, beg, beg. Going down to 32. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed that day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come out quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to your husband would have been left alive. David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. I've heard your words and granted your request. One of the things I got from this when I was studying is that sometimes we have to go out of the system. Sometimes we have to step out of the normal way of doing things, either to try to make peace with people or to try to reach out to people. She goes back, and he's in the house still holding a banquet like a king, partying on. She told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning when he was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him dead. Now, this is one of those places in the Old Testament where they would have interpreted it as God struck him dead, and God may have, but it may have just been this, and this, so, oh, he's dead, it must have been God. Interesting thing happens after this. When David heard he was dead, he said, praise to the Lord, kept his servant from doing wrong. He sends word to Abigail, doing what? What does verse, what number is it? Verse 39 say? 39, 40? What did he ask Abigail?
Become his wife.
To become his wife. How long had he known this woman? About long enough to accept a bunch of rich food from her. But he accepted. David had lots of wives. In case you're reading through this and you go, didn't he marry so-and-so? And didn't he marry so-and-so? He had 3 or 4 wives. But the conservative folks would tell us that marriage is one man and one wife. David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to make him become your wife, his wife. She bowed down and said, here is your maidservant ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants. Got on a donkey and attended by her 5 maids, again, rich woman. Went with David's messengers and became his wife. David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given Michal, David's wife, to another guy who was from another place. And we think soap operas started back in the 30s and 40s on the radio. What a mess. What a mess. A lot of this is about David fleeing and David running away, but turn over to chapter 28. We're kind of skipping through here some. I want to go over this one because it's interesting how this scripture and this story dealt with witches, fortune tellers, that kind of thing. I don't know what you feel, but a lot of people think that anything like that is of the devil. Somebody brought a Ouija board once to a youth group meeting at church, and oh my stars. Talk about tar and feather. They were so upset, that person. And somebody else one time when I was in college had a pack of tarot cards, T-A-R-O-T cards. And again, at a Baptist college, the whole college knew about it. I'm going to tell you up front, you know, my life is not dependent on what my horoscope says. I don't make major decisions over whether I turn up a Queen of Hearts or an Ace of Diamonds. Yeah, see how much I know about cards. But I do know that in this day and time, with David, people went on those things a lot. They even go back to Gideon's asking God for a sign. Let's look quickly at this story in chapter 28, starting at just at verse 3 and then moving on. Now Samuel was dead. Remember, Samuel was the prophet, right? That made all the kings. Samuel was dead. And all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritualists from the land. Saul had, I guess, tried to get things back on path just a little bit. The Philistines assembled and came out and set up a camp, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up another camp. Saul saw the Philistine army, and he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. Had God ever helped Saul with battles back in the earlier days? Had he helped David with battles? But as soon as he saw this big angry Philistines, who was the chief of the Philistines at one point? Goliath. You don't have a Goliath anymore. But he's still not just scared, not just frightened. The words that are used are really intense words. Afraid, terror filled his heart. So he talks to the Lord. But the Lord did not answer him by dreams or by Urim, which is another way they would do fortune telling or forth telling, or by prophets. Saul said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who's a medium so I can go and inquire of her." We're not told here how long he waited on God to answer. Did you notice that? Have you ever prayed and asked God about something and the answer did not come? Or did not come quickly? I love it when people come and ask you for advice, and if they don't like what you tell them, they go ask somebody else. And they go ask somebody else. And they quit asking when they find somebody that agrees with them. So Saul is in a hurry to find out what to do, so he's asked him to go find him a medium. And the Message Bible calls it a witch. Oh, there's one over at Endor. So instead of just calling for her, he goes into this whole disguise thing. This is so funny. Funny and not funny. Now he's the king. He's been the king for a good long while. Disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and two men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me and bring up the one I name." Bring up for me the one I name. The woman said, "Surely you know that what Saul has done. He's cut off the mediums and spiritualists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Do you think she already knew that it was Saul? Or maybe somebody that was in cahoots with Saul? "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And Saul says, "Bring up Samuel." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" "An old man wearing a robe is coming up." Sounds like that guy from Harry Potter, Voldemort, and I don't know what his name is, Gandor or something. I don't know. Anyhow, that's what it reminded me of. I obviously haven't read Harry Potter. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "Why don't you bother me? I'm dead. Can't you leave me alone? Can't you let me rest in peace?" "Oh, I'm in great distress. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel says, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." Remember how Saul had gotten in problems with Samuel, and Samuel said, "God's done with you"? I've known a lot of people who've gotten upset with God, walked away angry, until something happens. An illness, bad luck on their finances, and then they come back to God. Now, I'm thankful they come back to God, and I'm thankful that God has more patience than most of us would have. You ever know anybody that just said, "I'm not ever talking to God again, I'm not going to ever come to church again," Some of us, maybe some of us ourselves. "Because you did not obey the Lord," verse 18, "or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." And when he says be with me, I don't think he means here in front of this witch. What do you think he means?
You're right.
Dead. It's going to be dead. It's going to be dead. Immediately Saul fell 20 full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing both day and night. Again, I just get amused that they put this stuff in the Bible. I would have been panicked just by what he said, whether I had anything to eat or not. The woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken and said, "Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to. Now listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you can eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the women in urging, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground, sat on the couch. Again, here's somebody who's got a little extra fixed up already. The woman had a fatted calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour and kneaded it, baked some bread without yeast. And she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night they got up and left. If you're looking at a time frame here, it's already dark when he's gone to see the witch, okay? She shows him this vision of Samuel. He's upset and he's weak because he had anything to eat. At that point, she butchers and makes bread and fixes a meal, and yet he still leaves when it's night.
Sun had to come up here.
She still had to do a whole lot to get anything done in that 10 or 12 hours at most. Only reason I bring that up is because it just amazes me that she could have done that, and she could have, but that's part of the story. Part of the story, keeping the story going. Skip over to chapter 31. We're skipping some of these ongoing battles over and over and over. If your Bible has a heading on this chapter, what does it say?
The death of Saul and his sons.
The death of Saul and his sons.
Saul and Jonathan dead on the mountain.
Yep. Saul and Jonathan dead on the mountain. Saul takes his life. So you can kind of guess what this chapter is going to be about.
Saul's going to be dead.
Pardon me?
Saul's going to be dead.
Yeah, I kind of get the idea. You know, let's get the music. You know, the music on movies and soap operas when things are getting ready to turn bad. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fight grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. He's already seen his sons killed. He's wounded. And he says to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." He's asking his armor bearer, the guy that would be right there with him carrying his stuff, wants him to kill him. And why does he want him to kill him? So the Philistines won't abuse his body. You know what that means? He won't chop him up. He won't put him through torture. But the armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. Remember what David said so often about why he hadn't killed Saul? Because he shouldn't touch God's anointed. And even though Saul was already injured and dying, the armor bearer did not want to be the one to kill the king. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. You've heard that phrase, going to fall on the sword and going to take the blame for something. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that day. How did they know this? How did the writer of Samuel, 1 Samuel, know this? I mean, later we're going to find somebody who went and told, but again, it's a matter of nobody was there taking notes. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw the Israelite army had fled and their Saul and his son had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The king's dead, the princes are dead, everybody's running. Everybody's running. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. This is how they treated their enemies. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines, proclaiming the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Asherus, which was another god, and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall and went to another place where they buried them. Then they took their bones and burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree, and they fasted 7 days. Why did they burn the body? It wasn't a requested cremation. Why did they burn the body and bury the bones? Do you remember what David did with Goliath's head? Put it on a sword and carried it around, showing it off. I think they were afraid that their king, good and bad as he was, the body would be more mutilated. It would be carried from town to town. And they still had enough respect for him that they burned the body and buried the bones. So there wouldn't be any artifacts for these people to say, look what happened to Saul. There used to be a woman at the church here, Kathy Highfield, and she worked for the health department. And she was one that would go around and inspect restaurants. And there was a guy that owned restaurants here in town. I won't say his name because somebody might watch it and see it. But he had lots of infractions, and he was always giving her fits about it. Well, eventually, his place got torn down because he couldn't keep it going. And she went by and picked up a brick from the place. I said, now what you do is the next time anybody gives you grief about your inspections, you show them this brick and say, the last person had problems with me, that's what's left of his store, you know. So the Israelites did not want Saul's bones being carried around like that. Is there any part of that last little story that's especially sad?
Was it Jonathan, the Jonathan?
Jonathan was the Jonathan. Yep. He stayed with his dad, being a faithful son of the king, and it got him killed.
But it says all his men died together. Did they all kill themselves then?
Probably.
They only mentioned, him and his sword bearer.
That was the thing. If your leader died, that meant you had not protected him, which meant you needed to die too. You needed to die too. And we think the Marines are tough people. But the story's not over yet. David hears about this death. 2 Samuel. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag. Oh my, why did he just call these names? On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and to pay him honor. Well, evidently not all of them died. One got away. Where have you come from? I've escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? Tell me. The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. What did he leave out? Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. He left out the other two sons. Now, I think that's because he possibly knew how close David and Jonathan was. He didn't care about those other two names that nobody could pronounce. How do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead? Verse 6, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? And he said, who are you? An Amalekite. Then he said to me, stand over me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them back here to my Lord. Is there a problem with those two stories? Now, Amalekite is not an Israelite. That was another group they had fought against at one point. Why did this young man change the story? Did you catch he changed the story?
Build himself up.
To build himself up. Also, He took the crown and the band from the king and brought them to David. I think he probably did that hoping that would get him some kind of reward. Verse 11, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. This tearing their clothes, this rending of their clothes, one of the things I love about Middle Eastern people, even to today, when they mourn, they mourn. They don't sit over to the side and go, you know, they express their feelings. They've been brought up as part of their culture. Whereas in our Western culture, we're taught more often, you know, stiff upper lip, 3 days, get over it. And that just doesn't happen. And these men went through this same grieving. David said to the young man who brought him the report, where are you from? I'm the son of an alien, not like space alien, an Amalekite, he answered. And David said, why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of his men and said, go strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. You know, people come and go so strangely here. Don't you think David figured out that he hadn't really done that? He hadn't been the one to kill Saul. And if he was not afraid to kill Saul, what might he do next? Kill David, if he truly were that brave. For David said to him, your blood will be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan in order that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It's written in the book of Jashar, which we don't still have. David's poetic bent comes out here. It's not all just in the book of Psalms. I'm going to read this to you quickly from the Message Bible. O gazelles of Israel, struck down on your hills, the mighty warriors, fallen, fallen. Don't announce it in the city of Gath. Don't post the news in the streets of Ashkelon. Don't give those coarse Philistine girls one more excuse for a drunken party. No more dew or rain for you, hills of Gilboa, and not a drop from springs and wells. For there the warriors' shields were dragged through the mud, Saul's shield left there to rot. Jonathan's bow was bold. The bigger they were, the harder they fell. Saul's sword, was fearless. Once out of the scabbard, nothing could stop it. Saul and Jonathan, beloved, beautiful, together in life, together in death, swifter than plummeting eagles, stronger than proud lions. Women of Israel, weep for Saul. He dressed you in finest cottons and silks, spared no expense in making you elegant. The mighty warriors, fallen in the middle of the fight, Jonathan struck down on your heels. Oh, dear brother Jonathan, I'm crushed by your death. Your friendship was a miracle wonder, love far from exceeding anything I've known or ever hoped to know. The mighty warriors, fallen. The arms of war are broken to bits. I don't know that I've ever read that before. I don't know that I've ever read it out loud. But you can really see or hear the heart of David in that. It definitely adds light to the love he had for Jonathan, because he said it was better than ever he had ever known or ever thought he had known. That's some pretty heavy duty.
Passing the love of women.
Pardon me?
Passing the love of women is what it says.
Yeah, surpassing the love of women. Again, like I said before, I don't care what the relationship was, but they loved each other. Sometimes in your life, you have a friend that you love deeply, and you may never have an intimate relationship with them. You may never have them as a primary partner, but you just love them. And, you know, I have this friend, Laura Brown. Most of you have met her. Where's my glasses? Most of you have met her at some point. And Laura and I have been friends for 30 plus years. We're not in a relationship. We've never been single at the same time, which is probably a blessing to both of us. But But you know, whenever I've been in relationship with somebody, I've just told them, there's this person, Laura, and she has my heart. Not all of it, she has my heart. And if she needs something, I'm going to be there. And the same thing for her. She's going through some issues right now, and the first thing she said yesterday, when I was telling her how things was, do I need to come down there? Do I need to come? And so I think if nothing else, Jonathan and David give us this example of deep love and concern for someone that doesn't always have definition. I hope some of you have had that kind of friend. I hope you've had that kind of friend. Skip over to chapter 5. There's just a lot of battles and murder in between here. I just get kind of, you know, it's kind of like, almost gets gratuitous. It gets like, okay, somebody else died. Some other people got conquered. Somebody else died. But that was part of their struggle of trying to maintain as a country. They just didn't get Israel and put a little border around it, a little wall around it. They were continually being attacked by other groups and having to conquer other groups. Do you remember back when David was anointed as king? Who anointed him?
Samuel.
Samuel. And he picked him because he was the smartest, bravest, most intelligent of all of his father's sons, right? No. I love Jean's face. What? What? Where? No, remember he was the kid out in the fields watching the sheep. Remember, I love how Samuel saw this big, tall, good-looking son and thought, surely that's the king. But God had a better idea. He became king, he became anointed as king, but he went back to the field to take care of the sheep, right? And later on, he got to hang around the king because the king liked his music. Later on, he hung around the king and he made the king jealous about how good a soldier he was. He made Saul angry, and Saul had bad aim and several times threw swords at him and missed him. I really wonder what kind of king Saul really was, okay? Because there's a whole lot more about him being inept than not. But finally the time has come. Chapter 5, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their mighty campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. When all the elders of Israel had come in to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. I got the impression that David was the youngest son. I kind of got the impression he was at least a young teenager when all that first stuff happened. Let's say he was 15. He was told he was going to be king. He was anointed at 15. 15 years later, he sees that totally come into fruition. What do you think about that? Reminds me of my sermon title, Sunday in God's Time. You know, but look at all the things David had to go through before he was ready to become king. Do you think he could have come in from tending the sheep and become king at 15? No. He got in enough trouble as he got older, but that would have been even worse. So now he's king, and he ends up being king for 40 years. You say, well, that makes him only 70. In that day and time, 70 was a really ripe old age. You know, we're past the Methuselah stage when people live to be hundreds of years old. At this time, people, if they made it to 50 or 60. And the fact that he was able to stay king all that time talks about what a powerful, powerful person that he was. Let's go on, galloping through here, to chapter 7. I mean, we could take time in chapter 5 to read to you all these concubines and wives he had after he left Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him, and the names of all of them. verse 7, chapter 7. And it may not matter to us that he named his children, but to the Hebrews, that mattered. Think about the first chapters of Matthew and of Luke. What are that first chapter? What's a lot in that first chapter? So-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, proving their lineage. They had this going before Ancestry.com ever thought about it. I was listening to the radio today, and there's all this going on in England about whether they'll be European citizens or not. And there's a woman whose family had come from Portugal, and they were Jews who had lived there. Later on, they moved and ended up in England. She wants to be a Portuguese citizen now, so she can have a passport that'll get her in and out of Europe everywhere. So she's traced back through her Jewish heritage to prove that her family once was from Portugal. It's just interesting how even today these begats are important. So David has some promises from God. After the king was settled in his palace, the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, thank goodness finally, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a place of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent." The ark of God is that thing that they carried through the wilderness, Moses, those kind of guys. It had probably in it the 10 Commandments, the tablets for that, and it was a very important part of their worship. But they had not done much yet with making a special place for it. Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt up to this day? I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?' Now then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler of my people. If I've been with you wherever you've gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great like the names of the greatest men of all the earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord God himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever." Nathan reported to David all the words of the entire revelation. Do you think Nathan had any concern about going and telling David this? Why would he have concern?
Well, it wasn't necessarily always the smartest thing to tell the king that he couldn't do something he had in mind to do.
Yes, Nathan unfortunately was a bit of a yes man at that point. Well, that sounds like a good idea. Go ahead and do it, David. Nathan the prophet skipped a step. He didn't ask God. He didn't ask God. So the message comes down through this dream to Nathan that, yes, my ark does deserve a house. I do deserve to have a temple. I do to have a permanent place, not always moving from place to place. But David's not the one to do it. It's going to be his son. How do you think David, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but how do you think David would feel about that if you were David at that point in the story? David had the vision. David had the want to. But then God says, but you're not the one to do it. Now, he makes some other good promises. I'll never take myself away from your offspring. But you're not going to get to build the temple. How would you feel?
Hurt.
Hurt? On a good day, you say, well, it's just going to get built. Let me tell you, having bought and sold church buildings, I've been real glad it was somebody else. But, you know, he really wanted to do this, not to make himself great. He wasn't building the temple of David. But in God's time again. And David went in and sat before the Lord and said, after Nathan told him this, who am I, O sovereign Lord? What is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, O sovereign Lord, you have spoken about the future of the house of your servant. Is this your usual way of dealing with people, O Lord? What more can David say to you? For you know your servant. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are. There's no one like you. There's no God but you, as we've heard in our ears, in our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth God went out to redeem as a people for God's own self, to make a name for God and to perform great, awesome wonders by driving out nations? And there are gods before you whom you redeemed from Egypt. You've established your people, Israel, as your very own forever. And you, O Lord, have become their God. And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you've made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so your name will be great forever. Then people will say, the Lord Almighty is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established before you. O Lord Almighty God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to offer you this prayer. O sovereign Lord, you are God, your words are trustworthy, and you've promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, O sovereign Lord, have spoken with your blessings. The house of your servant will be blessed forever. So how did David deal with this disappointment? He agreed. He acquiesced, is a big word. He told God, I'm just thankful you're going to bless my family. Sometimes we have to realize, like David, it's not all about me. It's not all about me. But he picked the good things out of that. Instead of saying, oh, sovereign Lord, what's wrong with you? Why don't you let me build the temple? Instead, he just acknowledges God's provision for Israel and for his family and thanks him for it. It's not easy to thank God when things don't go the way you want them to. In my life, I don't know about yours. It's not easy to thank God when the answer is something different than you wanted. I don't think so often we get no's from God as we get a different yes. And it takes a lot of growth and maturity and trust to accept the different yes. We're going to stop there for tonight. We're just going to kind of gallop through a little bit more of this. Like I said, I'll pick out 3 or 4 sections if you want to continue reading on past chapter 8. And if something jumps out at you and you say, what is this about? What are they talking about? We'll try to work with that and talk about it too. Any last minute prayer requests or praises? Please continue to pray for my back too.
Did you ever find a grace?
I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I'm just going to be old and stubborn. Loving God, we thank you tonight for the example of David, of trusting you that you know the right answers and you know the right time. You gave him the vision and he brought it up, and you're going to allow his son to complete that vision. May we be willing to be people who get the vision and or people who fulfill the vision. But may we continue to stay in your sight and in your heart. In your name we pray.